Okay, everyone, welcome back. So we're going to jump right into where we stopped the other day. You're going to be looking at prompt number 12, and technically this will be prompt number 12, part 2, right? Because somehow I managed to put two prompt number 12. I don't know. Stuff happens. Anyway, we're going to be looking at this question real quick. How did Cecil Rhodes' methods contrast with the standard British policy of indirect rule in their colonies? And why do you think Britain was okay with what he was doing? So, thinking about that, let's take a look at what you wrote and maybe think about how there is a big picture involved here, right? Let's think about the answer, and there's a bunch of different ways we could answer this. So, there are many possible ones, but ultimately it's important to recognize that he was generating a great deal of wealth for the UK and himself, and that the lines between direct and indirect often became kind of blurry in these situations with how these different colonial powers from Europe controlled their colonies, especially when it came down to anyone who challenged the power of the colonial power and the colonists themselves. Also, it was becoming quite evident that South Africa was headed toward a European settler dominated national independence. So, the kind of independence that in this case would probably be more connected to the UK, some kind of a protectorate, maybe, like Canada and Australia and New Zealand. This is what Cecil Rhodes was kind of pushing for. And the UK felt it would be better to have South Africa as a close ally and strategic asset than to be some kind of a hostile power or a competitor. So, a lot of different reasons why this could be potentially the case. You might have some other ones that I didn't consider, and I would love to hear them. So, speaking of white settlers seeking independence in South Africa, the Bears were definitely over British domination by the end of the 1800s. And after a series of skirmishes over potentially gold and diamond rich regions where Bear settlers had established themselves, these Afrikaner farmers declared a separate strait in the Transvaal. So you can see that over here, this orange area, which is the South African Republic or Transvaal. They had established that area for themselves. And they called that the Orange Free State. They fought to expel all British independent black all British from the area, also independent black Africans. Servants on Bear farms were, of course, okay because they were working for them as farmhands and servants. And also, they wanted to expel Indian immigrants from the territory. So this situation resulted in a lopsided civil war between the British and the Bears. There's a lot of guerrilla warfare with ambushes, sabotage, raids, etc. There's this picture is a typical Bear commando unit that has farmers and townspeople. They harassed British lines of communication a bunch. Really good marksmen could snipe at people from a distance. The British wanted to unify the territories essentially, and the Bears wanted their freedom from the British to rule over their own region as their own colonists. Um, there was a massive military response from the British that, in large part, targeted civilian populations. So, in this period, in their effort to win, the British actually did some very extreme stuff that had not been seen in a lot of other circumstances. Some places in the world had, in particular in the United States, these sorts of techniques have been used against Native Americans by the United States. But the British, what they did was they actually scorched the earth. They burned down the earth and salted it on the farms that the Bears had. And then they would also forcefully relocate many of these bears into concentration camps. This is actually a picture of one of the ones established for bears during the war. Many people, especially children, died from disease and starvation in these places. And there were also thousands and thousands of black people put into separate concentration camps. This is actually the beginning of the term concentration camp. So, concentration camp in this sense is basically an overcrowded, viciously policed and guarded, under provisioned with food, full of civilians, teeming with untreated disease zone, walled in. Black Africans that were living in the Transvaal, many of whom worked as servants and farmhands on the Bear farms, were forced into the war as well. Most of the men were conscripted to fight with the British, while others, especially the soldiers' families, were kept in their own race-segregated concentration camps. Male Bear combatants were mostly sent overseas as prisoners, while their families went to the camps. Between the 45 Bear camps and the 66 Black African concentration camps, There were over 165,000 people imprisoned. And in the end, around 20,000 black prisoners, between 14,000 and 20,000, and around 20 to 24,000 bears died in the camps because of starvation disease. It was mainly children. There was a scandal in Britain, though ultimately very little came of it. However, the blueprint for these brutal camps would be copied many times in the 20th century by oppressive regimes. So, Cecil Rhodes' dream did end up becoming true. He, of course, had been the governor of the British Cape Colony in the earlier years, including during the Civil War with the Bears, but he died in 1902. So his dream came true in 1910. South Africa became an independent state, a protectorate of the UK like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., but with its own government. This was the unification of the Cape Colony, the Natal Colony, the Transvaal, and the Orange River Colony. It included the territories that were formerly a part of the South African Republic and the Orange Free State that had been fighting in the Boer Civil War. At this point, white South Africans, the Afrikaners and British, were at their peak population, somewhere around 14 to 16% of the overall population of South Africa. So guess who has power? Well, English and Dutch were the official languages, right? So there's your hint. It was a country with a parliament, technically a democracy. However, it was dominated by a now unified white settler minority who had almost all political and economic power. So this was a white dominated state, the British and colonists and the Dutch colonists getting together to govern the state. In 1912, the African National Congress was formed. This is a picture of a delegation of them that came to London to try to gain the support of the British government against the racist policies that were starting to be instituted by this government. It was an unsuccessful mission. The ANC formed in 1912 in direct response to injustice against black South Africans at the hands of the government now in power. It could be, then in power, I should say. It can be said that they had their origins in a pronouncement by Pixley Kaiska Seme, who said in 1911, "Forget all past differences among Africans and unite in one national organization." That sounds kind of familiar, right? Maybe a little bit similar to the Pan-Africanist idea that was later heard in the post-colonial states, including the Congo. Black Party members could not vote or hold political office, of course, in the country, but they did participate in a variety of activist causes and major strikes to protest white minority rule, including these major organized labor strikes. In 1912, again, we were seeing the beginning of Africans starting to fight back politically, despite the fact that they were largely locked out of the electoral system. The connection with Indian immigrants included Mahatma Gandhi, who was a lawyer in Durban and Johannesburg. He was an Indian immigrant lawyer and an anti-oppression activist. And he pioneered new techniques of civil disobedience and mass nonviolent protest that he advocated for in South Africa. He lived there for 23 years, and where both Indians and black Africans were treated as second-class citizens, deeply unequal to whites. Gandhi actually eventually led the successful movement for Indian independence from Britain. He went back to India, and that movement succeeded in 1947 when Britain left the British colonial empire. And then Gandhi was assassinated in January of 1848 by a Hindu extremist. So it's important to note here, real quick, that I'm just going to go back to this slide for a sec. Sorry. It's important to note that the labor strikes and nonviolent resistance to white-dominated rule were often brutally suppressed by white police forces in South Africa and by the government. And this also led to a more militant wing of the African National Congress starting around 1961, which over time engaged in periodic targeted acts of violence against white South African government officials and business leaders, particularly those who were responsible for crackdowns on political activity and nonviolent protest. So between this period of time, there began to be new segregation policies that were passed. One of the earlier ones was passbooks that were required. So these passes were used in South Africa to stop the free movement of people from rural to urban areas. These gave authorities a very powerful method of control. All non-whites needed to carry passbooks. That included Indian immigrants and black immigrants. In particular, this was really aimed at stopping the free movement of Black people from rural areas where they were pushed into settlements and stopping them from moving into urban areas because they didn't want them competing for jobs. When they were allowed to move, it was only under very specific conditions with the permission of a local consulate and then allowed just generally to work very specific jobs that were usually unskilled labor in the white dominated cities. So there were other policies too. Very early on, the Native Land Act prevented Native Africans from owning their own land. This was a very major thing. There are echoes of this that South Africa still continues to deal with today. It stipulated that Black South Africans could only own land in extremely limited circumstances and specific reservations that together comprised about 7% of the country's farmable land. In whole, this act made 80% of the land available to whites, who were around 16%, 14 to 16% of the population, and the remaining 20% of the land for everyone else. And again, only about 7% of that 20%, or only about 7% of the land, which is to say, 13% of the other land was terrible. Only about 7% was actually farmable. So in addition, Black people were generally required to live on the reservation areas. Many were violently uprooted and displaced from their own lands and pushed into these areas, oftentimes from more fertile zones. So this remaining land, fertile land in the country, which was about 93% of the fertile land, was parceled out and sold to white farmers, both Bears and British farmers. In the Transvaal, where the Bears established their free state prior to the country's unification, Blacks had been forbidden to own land since 1876, so that was nothing new there. Meanwhile, Afrikaners in the cities and Bears in the countryside, and remember, Bears are also Afrikaners, they are Afrikaner farmers. They were setting aside their differences and uniting under a banner of white supremacy and white nationalism. And in particular, this was focused on Afrikaner identity. They were against the British government, both for historic reasons from the Civil War and colonialism, and also many Afrikaners were angry with Britain for opposing Hitler's ultra-racist Nazi regime in Europe. They also were angry with them over issues of religion. There was the Calvinist Protestantism of the Bears, which played a role. And there were many, many publications that strove to recast Afrikaner identity as an indigenous African identity instead of a settler colonialist identity. This tied into social Darwinism and this idea of separation of the races, scientific racism, and eugenics, of purifying races from each other. It was a real powerful and dangerous intellectual movement to validate racism, white supremacist racism, in a national government. So it grew, and it gained support from some of the more conservative white supremacist British colonists as well. This movement culminated in 1948 when the Afrikaner Nationalist Party won the election to control the country decisively. Dr. Daniel Malan won this by uniting Afrikaners of all classes. The Bears and the Afrikaners in the cities had been at odds for a long time, but they put aside their differences and united under the theme of white supremacy and keeping the non-white population of South Africa essentially in check and disempowered. So now I want you to think about prompt number 13. Why did official government policy in South Africa become increasingly oppressive toward Black South Africans and Indian immigrants? Give me a paragraph on this at least, please. Why did official government policy in South Africa become increasingly oppressive towards Black South Africans and Indian immigrants? What were the reasons for this? Why? This is kind of a review, right? So write them down in your notes and pause. Okay. So as you're thinking about that review and about the reasons why this happened, let's get into some of the specifics and what they called the system that they was already to some extent in existence, but now it had a name and it had a very official, strict government policy around it, building on former government policies. This was called apartheid, pronounced apartheid. In 1948, this began to be the official law of the land. It was a system of segregation. Is illegal segregation of races in South Africa. It means apartness. You can see an example of that here on this beach in the city of Durban, where it says this bathing area is reserved for the sole use of members of the white race group. So there it is in English, there it is in Afrikaans underneath it, and there it is in Zulu underneath that. So just making sure nobody misses the point that this beach was for whites only. In Afrikaans, it's pronounced apartheid, which seems somewhat appropriate. Some of the conditions of this legal code were that interracial couples, both dating and marriage, were banned. People were forced to register by their color with the state. And this, of course, tied into these pass cards and identity cards. There were limits on education for Black people, especially with the university level. And high schools were limited in what they could teach and how far they could get in educational attainment. And there was forced resettlement of Black people in these 9 small, quote unquote, homelands, which were basically reservations. So only South Africans of European descent, white South Africans, could vote or hold public office. Also, this was excluding mixed race South Africans as well. Segregation in most areas of public life, which included restaurants, trains, beaches, entire neighborhoods and towns. That's where those places were all completely separate. Black laborers were forced to live in these homelands. These were overcrowded reservations in the dry, hot, marginal areas. Remember, a very small percentage of these were farmable. They could only leave these places with their passbooks to do work in the white-dominated areas, and even then, they were considered the lowest priority for hiring, well below skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled whites. In fact, job discrimination in favor of whites was legally required by the law. East Indians were also excluded from these same areas that were reserved for whites. We're going to watch a short video from a scholar named Fatima Meer right now on daily life under apartheid. She's a South African writer and academic.
One had to be very careful if one was in a public park or a public garden. You had to know your place as a non-European. That was the biggest effect. If you were an African, then you had no right of movement outside of the rural areas in which you lived. You had to get firstly a permit from a local magistrate to leave your rural area and seek employment in the urban area. And once you were in the urban area, you had to carry your pass, as they called it, on your person all the time, because at any point a police could stop you, ask you for your pass, and if you did not have that magisterial permit, you could be arrested and put into prison. And there were every day thousands of arrests, and the courts were full with these cases.
The situations being described by Ms. Meer were leading into a great deal of civil unrest. There were protests going on throughout South Africa. One of the most dramatic and terrible ones of these were actually a protest at the township of Sharpeville, where pass card protesters who were tired of having to show their cards and get approval for being able to go and work went to protest at a local constable's office, at a local police office. They were shot by police. There were 68 of them killed. They were shot most of them shot in the back, as you can see from the picture, while they were running away from a police station. It's really important to recognize that there are different narratives that exist about this. For a long time on the Wikipedia page, up until I think last year, there had actually been a profound amount of misinformation that was on that page, talking about how the people in the police in the station were under attack and they were shooting to defend themselves. But in fact, all eyewitness accounts from the incident, including one of the police officers, disputed that account. And it turns out that the sources those were drawn from, that they linked in the Wikipedia page, were from white supremacist books that came out at the time. So it's very important to remember to always look at your sources. Um, so Nelson Mandela is shown here in the lower picture in jail. This is him later in life. Nelson Mandela was the leader of the ANC at this time. That's the African National Congress. Remember, they were outlawed in this period, and they were started to be treated as a terrorist organization, partly because they were beginning to recognize that that nonviolent protest was not always successful, and so they were considered to be a terrorist organization. They went underground, and they still continued to do nonviolent protest, but also there were occasionally violent protests that specifically targeted bombings and other killings of government officials and white supremacists. Nelson Mandela was jailed in 1964 for treason. The charges were technically for conspiring to overthrow the state. In 1961, by the way, South Africa's government, they cut their ties with the UK. They were no longer a protectorate. And they strengthened their ties with the United States, where the US still had our own legal segregation system with Jim Crow. And they were presenting themselves as a strong African ally against communism with the United States. So they became a US ally, and this would play a very key role in how apartheid was perpetuated. Here's a video from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was another anti-apartheid protester at the time, who had some very powerful perspectives, and a quick breakdown of the Sharpeville massacre.
On the 21st of March, 1960, when Desmond was 28, South Africa exploded in violence. Police shot down unarmed protesters in what became known as the Sharpeville Massacre.
I was in my final year at theological college. I was already going to be ordained at the end of that year. 69 people were killed, and most of them were shot in the back as they were running away, protesting against the past laws. I remember it as a moment when you realized that black life was cheap. It was an awful time, I mean, where you were aware that for most white South Africans, we were human, but, by the way,
Yeah.
They are human, but, they're not very clean, are they? I mean, they're not very clever, are they? And they steal, don't they? I mean, you can't leave anything that you think is valuable when they are around.
You'll use the main entrance if you're white.
You went into a post office, you had to use separate entrances. We'd just come back from England with our youngest child. We had 4 children. The youngest was born in London. And she saw some children playing on swings and so on. And she said, I want to go and play. And we had to say, no, sweetheart, you can't. And she said, but there are other children playing. And it was incredibly difficult. I mean,
Difficult to explain.
It really just made you feel, I wish the ground could open and swallow me up. How do I tell my child that, yes, you are a child, but you're not a child like those other children who are on the swings, on the roundabouts? We lived in ghettos. Black children were also getting government school feeding. When Favot took over, he stopped it because he said, and this was his reasoning, we can't feed all of these children, so we are not going to feed some. I mean, it's a bizarre thing. I mean, to say, no, we're not going to try and cure any people who have TB because we can't cure all of them, so we will cure none. I mean, that is bizarre in
While the Sharpeville massacre was a major turning point, a very important one that came after that, and probably the biggest turning point, was actually the Soweto uprising in 1976. Black high school students were protesting forced instruction in Afrikaans. The police opened fire on protesters. They killed 23 people who were mostly high school students. Uprisings sparked across the country. Over 1,000 died, mostly protesters. This is a very powerful image that came out of this, the death of Hector Peterson, who was 13 years old and was shot. We're going to have Fatima Mir tell you about the Soweto uprising and its significance in South Africa. Anti-apartheid activist Fatima Mir.
A new law was passed which said that high school kids had to be instructed in Afrikaans and they had to write their exams in Afrikaans. Now, Afrikaans was not their language. You didn't have African teachers who could teach in Afrikaans, and the kids couldn't really write or respond in Afrikaans. They organized themselves into a huge resistance movement, and they began marching. The government saw the revolution and brought out its military power and pointed it at the children. The soldiers began madly shooting the children down. And there was one dramatic picture of a child picking up a dead child and walking. And I think that picture eventually got to the conscience, the unfeeling white conscience, because for years we were asking the European powers, and especially the European capitalists, to boycott the Nats, the South African government, and they wouldn't listen. Then for the first time, the international European community began to think, and they began to boycott the South African government, withdrew the financial support they had been giving all the years to apartheid, and the government collapsed. There was a lot of resistance in the country, a great deal of turmoil against apartheid. But the crucial factor in defeating apartheid was the withdrawal of the economic support that the government had always got.
As Fatima Mir discussed, it's really important to recognize that South Africa was really dependent on the countries of Europe and the US as trading partners, and very sensitive to any political or economic pressure from them. After Soweto, international pressure mounted and built up, and apartheid actually seemed to be on its last legs in the late 1970s. However, there was a major event in 1980 that happened. Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States. And Reagan was very pro-South Africa. He was openly indifferent to its brutal racist policies of apartheid, as he believed the main opposition to it, which was the banned African National Congress Party, Nelson Mandela's party, was sympathetic to communism and socialism. Reagan remained a staunch defender of the racist South African government throughout the 80s. International opposition elsewhere steadily increased, and many people in the US also supported consumer efforts to boycott South African products and trade. Full disclosure, I was one of the kids protesting that as a little kid with my parents, protesting South African apartheid in San Francisco. And we got attacked by police. Interesting. However, the support of the United States government kept apartheid on life support for a full other decade. It wasn't until Reagan left office and Soviet communism declined in power that the US became more sympathetic to the struggle of Black South Africans and changed some official policies. So it took a long time. There's a lot of international outrage that built. There were sanctions and boycotts. The South African economy began to suffer. And then finally, in the late 1980s, the U.S. policy shifted, and that began to be a real thing. President F.W. de Klerk had to recognize political reality. Under massive international pressure and mounting boycotts, on the 3rd of February 1990, State President F.W. de Klerk lifted the long ban on the black-run political party, the African National Congress, and released its leader, Nelson Mandela, from jail on 11 February 1990. On 17th of March 1992, the apartheid referendum was passed by the whites-only electorate, removing apartheid and then allowing ANC to run a 1994 election. So major stuff happened here. Since the 1994 election, the ANC has performed better than 55% in all general elections, including the most recent 2019 election. However, the African National Congress Party, which Nelson Mandela led, and he passed away a few years back, has been embroiled in a number of controversies in the last decade or so, since 2011. South Africa faces some major problems, especially with corruption in government. But they've had a series of mostly successful national elections, as well as local, like all kinds of local elections and work, at a high participation rate among the voters. Since the end of white rule, a democratic culture appears to be taking hold, allowing the vast majority of people in South Africa at least some say in the search for solutions. There's still some ongoing issues like land redistribution. Most farmland is still white owned. So the government acquired a lot of land on a willing buyer, willing seller basis, but officials have been signaling that they're going to be doing more expropriations, which is to say taking back land, especially the stuff that was distributed around 1913 when the Native Land Act was passed. So they're working on transferring 30% of farmland back to Black South Africans, and they've met a lot of resistance from white landowners from that. So there's still a lot of conflict. To recap here, just to give you a recap, the white government, which came to power in 1948 in South Africa, enforced a separation of races with its policy called apartheid. It dictated that black and white communities should live in separate spaces, travel in different buses, and stand in their own lines. The government introduced grand social engineering schemes, such as the forced resettlement of hundreds of thousands of people. It poisoned and bombed opponents and encouraged trouble in neighboring countries. This continued until the early 1990s, when that government system ended. Very much Africa's superpower, South Africa has the continent's biggest economy, though it is very vulnerable to global recessions and depressions and has a critical shortage of drinking water in many areas. This is the result of worldwide climate change. Still, as far as post-colonial Africa is concerned, South Africa has been had a pretty good amount of national success. It's considered to be something of a success story. So, stop here in a minute. You're going to be looking at some Constitution preambles that you have already looked at. But you're going to have a whole different perspective on them now. These are preambles to constitutions. This is the South African Constitution of 1994. That's to say the post-apartheid Constitution versus the Constitution of the United States from the late 1700s. I'm going to want you to look at the preambles of these. The preambles of these constitutions. Now that you know a bit more, there's going to be a recap of this. I want you to take a look at these. There's a recap on the sheets for the different constitutions, talking about the nature of the states. I want you to answer the prompts. Then the one prompt that we just did in there. And I want you to use your notes and other knowledge on the subject. And then I want you to do the final essay that's on these sheets. So it plus the quick write that you did already today will be due next class. So go ahead, do that document. Talk to you then, and thanks so much for paying attention.